I just like kind of bumped her and she goes, oh, like girl.
Aw. Yeah, Stella will probably come here, baby girl. You want to
She
join us?
she is like so she's I don't
She just wants
she's
to be.
yeah, she's like up in the business right now. I don't I don't
This is a podcast not only about astrology, but living with cats.
yeah, for
Um,
real. I mean like she is just like she's like touch me, but don't touch me.
she's like, I just want to be your scarf today
Yeah, I
or
want to be your
headpiece.
disappearing what is it? Disappearing butt chart cat.
Incredible.
Yeah.
One of these days I'll pull up the chart and just see like what's on the what's going on right now. I have a cat that's over hanging out in the corner who might decide to join us, might not. But welcome to another episode of Growing with the Stars, where we talk astrology, try to placate our feline overlords, and make astrology make sense for whatever is coming your way. And I am Katie, a nerdy traditional astrologer.
And I'm Kat. Now I got a second one. Actually, I guess there's three of us technically.
Oh my God. We're gonna have a full house today, apparently, both human and non-human. And we are I don't know if it's ironic or not to be recording this on Mother's Day, but we're going to be talking about the Sibley chart, aka the chart for the United States, sort of getting back into some history, what it tells us about the United States, how do you understand national charts, and how transits and other things might be showing up for it. We'll see what we get through today. There might be a couple parts to this, but we'll break it down into some plain English as we go.
Does the United States have mommy issues? Stay tuned.
I was about to be like, and I was like, no, let's wait and see. But I feel like a lot of times when it comes to something like this, I'm going to be saying things you're going to be like, oh yeah, that makes complete sense because astrology is usually reading you for filth, right? That's unfortunately how often it goes. Um, and so when we often talk about astrology, usually we're saying things like we're thinking about people. And so like, can a nation have a chart? And in astrology, yes. As long as you know the birthday, the birthplace, the birth time, there is a chart. Now, when does a nation or a state begin? That can be kind of tricky. What do you define as the beginning? As Kat would say as a historian, like how do you define the start of one of these things?
I know in school they just told us to pick a point, otherwise you'll go crazy. But as you were talking about that, I guess I would, I was thinking about like if you were starting like maybe like a new dynasty, the moment where you maybe uh the old guy. Uh
That's
like
that's definitely a choice.
yeah. But yeah, I mean the declaration is a pretty I mean, you're basically breaking away from something and declaring something new. So, I mean, that's pretty big. And it was pretty big. It was really they were signing essentially their own death warrant if they lost. So,
Yeah. Yeah. And so like, yeah, with the United States, we're really lucky that it's a relatively very young nation, right? We have some pretty good dates and times. And we'll get into the Sibley chart. But yeah, for some nations like Russia, like how early do you start? When do you start? For Britain or England, when do you start, right? It's some of these places are so old that it gets trickier. And so that's where we would do things like recurrence transits, things like that. And different places are sensitive to different things. Um, and that's just kind of part of it. So the Sibley chart's important. It's not the be all and end all. There's also debate about it because just because we know the day the declaration was signed, we don't actually have the best timing for exactly when the Declaration was signed. Okay. Some of the things that we're going to talk about today, I'll mention it, but like take it with a bit of a grain of salt because it's like we're not 100% sure. But the Sibley chart is essentially named after this guy, Ebenezer Sibley, which is such a 19th century name. And he rectified for when the Declaration was signed. So he basically did the art of rectification, where you sort of work backwards to sort of try to exactly get where the ascendant would be. There's different tips and techniques that people use for that. And this was pushed and popularized by an incredibly influential I believe he's a 20th century astrologer, Dane Rudyard. He's super important in the sort of more psychological side of astrology. Um, but that sort of is where this chart comes from. So you often just hear it called the Sibley chart. Um, and so let me share my screen so you can see it. And I actually have a traditional one up. Let me pull in the outers.
And one question or a couple questions for you.
Yeah.
Hold on. So, are there other charts with that like are like contested with this one that are like other people argue for versus this chart? And my other
Yeah.
question would be, um, even if the timing is not super precise, is there a super significant difference in the sense of like, do we know that they signed it, generally speaking, like in the morning, the afternoon, and so on?
So most people are working with the 1776 July 4th date, right? This moment. And so there's some people that are like, well, Jefferson was known to like kind of like his drink. And so could have been writ much earlier in the day rather than being as late as it is. So the main changes are going to be the ascendant is going to be a big change, and the houses where the planets are going to be changed, and also the moon's degree. So the moon moves a degree about every 2.5 hours, if I'm remembering it correctly. So I feel pretty confident. I mean, we will clearly still have this Cancer stellium, which is Venus, Jupiter, the Sun, and Mercury retrograde, all in the sign of Cancer. We'd still have Uranus and Mars together, co-present in Gemini, right? A lot of these planets' placements would still be the same. The moon would still be in Aquarius, unless the declaration was signed about, so 3 degrees, unless it was signed very late in the day. We're talking around almost midnight on July 4th, which I doesn't seem historically accurate, just based on I think what I do recall from that day. Um, so that being said, there are some things that we might talk about, like the decan of the moon and how true does that feel to you and that lived experience. Like, is the moon much earlier in the day? It would have probably then moved into what's called the second decan or the second face, which would have been Mercury. And the main shift would be this ascendant. Um, this chart very much resonates for me and what I see in the United States. And so that's why I bring it up and that's why I bring it forward as sort of like the best of what we do have as of now. There are other important dates, obviously, for the United States that we can take a look at, right? Like the beginning of creating the Constitution, right? Or other significant moments that's in the formation of the United States that we know today. But this is the main date I think people use as really the initiating of the United States. Um, so this chart, what we're taking a look at, is a Sagittarius rising chart. The sun is in Cancer, right? And of all the other things in Cancer, and the moon is in Aquarius. These are sort of what I would call the big three of the United States chart. Um, we're going to kind of dive into it because there's so much that you can get from particularly the rising sign, the moon, and that Cancer stellium that I think really speaks to the United States. Um, so let's just start there, right? Let's think about like a Sagittarius rising. And I'll go back to it just for 1 second because, right, this is a Sagittarius rising. So the first thing I really just want to take a look at that we're dealing with this ascendant at 12 degrees of Sagittarius. And so there's a couple of things that we're going to look at. But first off, it's that the Sagittarius rising is ruled by an exalted Jupiter, something that is raised up, where Jupiter is very happy. Um, Jupiter, has Venus with him, like they're within 3 degrees, which is a very tight, what we call it adhesion, which is, they're coming very close together, and it's very, very positive. It's very, very optimistic. This is like we love when we see the benefics hanging out together, and you know, there's a loose square with Saturn, but they can't see Mars. So there's already we're seeing some pretty positive indicators in this chart. Um, we're seeing something that where you're going to be raised up. There's a lot of potency and ability to get things done. Um, that's super important. And so when we think about Sagittarius, we're thinking about something that is sort of some of the code words both for Jupiter, but also like what is Sagittarius itself, right? So Sagittarius is a mutable fire masculine sign. So adaptable, very responsive. It's not necessarily initiating things, but it's responding to things. Fire, it's very expressive. Like the fire signs have no subtlety. And I say this as a fire rising sign. Like my face is always going to tell you what it's thinking. Okay. There's no like hiddenness. Um,
Yeah, no, we can't.
right. Right. There's like nobody says that Americans are subtle. No one has ever said that about Americans. Or if they had, they were lying. All right. They were lying. Right. And so you get this like larger than life, this expansion, this curiosity, all of these things are sort of baked into a lot of the identity of the nation, right? Um, we also get this like very philosophical leaning, right? Jupiter as a planet rules philosophy and larger structures and having these like big harmonies. And what do we call ourselves? The land of the free, right? Think about the like things that we talk about ourselves. We love a big idea, like a toxic version of this, the manifest destiny. Like our destiny is to cross, from sea to sea, and like just don't think about the details of like the poor indigenous people that were already fucking there.
What part of that chart is that where we just go like this?
Well, I think that's partly Jupiter in general. Like it has a big philosophy, but he's not always thinking about the details of it. That's a piece of it. There is the sort of underlying um, warlike nature, which is going to kind of come up in two ways, which is super interesting to me as an astrologer. So the first is right. This chart is in the middle decan of Sagittarius. I'll share my screen again so we can just see it. Right. So the decan is these sort of three right here. There's two sets of rulerships, and one set of rulerships for the decans, it's ruled by the moon. And I believe in the Ptolemaic one is what it's called. Mars is the co-ruler. So we get this continued sort of lunar, emotional, wandering, changeable nature of the moon. And we get some of that aggression, right? We get some of that conflict. We get some of that warlike nature of Mars. Mars, right, is the knife. He is irritation and he's, you know, the god of war in Roman mythology, right? And when you dig into the Decan on this, what's really interesting is there's different images that astrologers have used over time to describe it, right? One of the ones that people know, if you've dug into the Decans at all, you've probably heard of this thing called the Picatrix, which is a Latin text from the medieval era. Um, and he talks about this Decan. We're going to talk about the image, and then we're going to break it down. He says, quote, a man who leads cows and holding a monkey and a bear before him. And this is a face of fear, lamentation, mourning, misery, and inquietude. So there's a lot there that we can unpack. But there's holding a lot of burden, there's a lot of responsibility there. And there's also a lot around this idea of what is bravery, right? At its best, we're going to get kind of the moon's emotionalness, sort of like the fear, and then being brave regardless of that. And at its worst, you get fear-based aggression, which if you've ever met an animal with fear-based aggression, they can get pretty wild and almost rabid, is I think the way to describe it, if they have a feeling that they are being potentially threatened. Right. And I think you see that sometimes in the United States, where there is this emotional reactive quality to aggression.
Or, you know, the concept of the other and that fear, like Chinese Exclusion Act, the anti-immigration acts and stuff like that, where they're like, oh no, they're gonna take over and um all of this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you bring up something interesting because Kira Ryberg is a really fantastic astrologer who has a book all on the decans. In the way she describes this decan or face, it's those who walk this face are often presented with these stress tests as it relates to their core values, ideals, and visions. And so we do have these stress tests, right? About, are we the land of the free or are we this place of highly restrictive immigration, right? Is everyone free or is it just white people that are free, right? Is it a democracy or is it about getting rich, right? Is it about capitalism, right? Is it, who is liberated and who deals with imperialism? Like there's if you're going to have these high-minded ideals, I think that's where a lot of sort of the stress and tension of the United States is, and it is really built into that that section of the sky. And there's some interesting echoes in other parts of the chart too. I think what's interesting too is like there is, I think, an interesting overlap of like Pluto and Aquarius, and the fact that in the Sibley chart, the United States moon is an Aquarius, and so there is this sort of like very deeply emotional, but also like the moon's often really the people and represents the sort of everyday person in a world in a mundane or like a national chart. Um, and I do think that there is this idea of like that is sort of tied in there too. We also see the like martial quality. So there's this thing in astrology called there's lots of ways you can subdivide a zodiac sign. We've talked a little about the decans. There are the bounds, which we'll get back to as well. And there's also this thing called the 12th part, where you kind of each zodiac sign is then got like a hidden bit of another like all of the 12 zodiac signs in it. What we see is like this is the 12th part on the outside. It's like you see like every zodiac sign gets a little sliver in it. And at 12 degrees, like 21 arc seconds, the 12th part for the ascendant is Aries. Now, this is one of those things I would take a grain, take with a grain of salt, right? If literally this chart is off by like 10 minutes, it's a different 12th part, right? It's that kind of level. But I wanted to bring in a quote from a translation that Ali Olimi did of Abu Mashar, who was this very important medieval astrologer, on the 12th on Aries, and I thought it was very resonant to what I know about the United States. Um, and it goes, those born here in the Aries 12th part have the will to get whatever they desire and will be swift in action. They speak and walk quickly. Many will move from their birthplace. An older man or woman of esteem will offer them station in life or help them on their path. They will have great lust and passions. They will do what they must to be successful. Sound familiar at all?
Well, the older man or woman offering them like status is interesting since we broke away from Great Britain, which gave us kind of world status to start, plus winning a war, with them in the beginning of the country. Plus, in winning that war, having made uh ties with France, which we didn't necessarily lose afterward. It's just like,
Yeah. Yeah. So
it's
I was
just like,
thinking, my first thought was, right, France, right? Like a huge piece of the United States making the revolution successful was the esteem of of basically getting France and to bankroll them. Um, but we also get the sort of land of immigrants, right? Like people are moving here. That's a huge part of sort of the national mythos, even though there were lots of indigenous people that were here before. There's the impulsiveness, the desire. There's a lot of like, right, the sort of greediness sometimes we talk about, like, I think is also sort of baked into this. And I think a lot of it too is this idea of so much of the American dream is success, right? The American dream is to have a certain level of economic success. The last piece of the ascendant that is really interesting that I think, there is this sort of martial ruffling feathers, a little bit quality or the warrior quality. But this ascendant, the other piece, right, there are the bounds, and these are another form of minor rulership. It's typically seen as a little more potent than the decan. So the bounds are sort of considered like having a room inside Sagittarius. And so Sagittarius is Jupiter's house. Um, the ascendant is within Venus's room or bound of Jupiter's house, if that makes sense. So both Jupiter and Venus also have some important things to play here. And the Jupiter and Venus are also very close together. So they're mixing and mingling their significations a little bit for the United States.
it's like just right, squeezing right in there,
Yeah,
right?
it's literally like squeezing in. Um, I don't think you can really see it super well, but yeah, it's like just squeezed in. Basically, at 12 degrees is where Venus's bound begins, and that's 12 degrees, 21 arc seconds. So, yeah. And that's where we would say, like, once again, like, an hour earlier, completely different bound. Um, and Venus, right, brings in the charm, the vibes. She brings in that harmony, another sort of moderating benefic. But she's also bringing in connections. She knows a lot of, she's bringing in the friendships and the benefits. And so, the United States has both been very lucky, but also has had incredibly strong alliances, right? If we think about France and the Revolution and the Allies during World War II, um, very successful on building sort of a world organization or for alliances around it. And the Venus, right, is really tied into that as well.
I'm not gonna lie, I'm dying to get to the part where we talk about transits right now because setting up the foundations, I'm just like, ooh, this is juicy. This is like Threads tea. This is like when you get on Threads and you're like talking about that lady's $50 cheesecake and you're like, excuse me.
Oh
Did
my
you see the
God.
cheesecake? It's bad.
I did not.
Oh, it was
Uh,
sad. It was like she paid $50 for a cheesecake. It was like this. It
no,
it was very sad.
dude. What is it, that has to have some like truffle oil from like Italy that no one has ever tasted before.
It did have the bottom of the spring form can, I think, still attached to it though.
Wow. Wow. I'm ready to fight for people in the comments. Oh my God. Okay. 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 Um, that's insane. Now I'm going to talk about the Cancer stellium. I'm not going to go into depth on each piece of it, but like we've seen the sun there, Mercury retrograde is there, Venus is there, Jupiter is there, and the lot of fortune is there, right? So this is a really intense stellium of planets that are all ruled, like the ruler of Cancer is the moon. So we're going to talk about the sign of Cancer for a minute, and then we're going to go and dig into the moon in Aquarius. And like, what do we like when I think about Cancer, the sign, it's got a couple of like breakdown features that we can talk about. It's cardinal, it's water, and it's considered sort of feminine in the traditional binary, or what I would call like receptive, right? So,
So if we work on our mommy issues as a country, we can do it. We can get past this.
uh, maybe, yeah. I mean, we've got some intense things that we're dealing with, but generally speaking, Cancer is known for being changeable. It's right initiating the summer at not equinox. Well, it's the summer solstice. It is not an equal sun moment, right? The sun, the longest day of the year in the northern hemisphere is when the sun enters Cancer. Um, and we get this sort of it's an interesting thing because it's very much wander. The moon's a wanderer. He moves super fucking quickly. He's always going different places. So there's a lot of just changeable emotional that like the this and the that and da 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 da. Like it's not very consistent. But it's also very, right? It's a water sign. It's emotional. It's based around an emotional thing rather than logic, rather than rules, rather than like an intellectual piece to it. And so with Cancer, you get this very like protectiveness to it, right? It's very much me versus the world. Um, you think about the sign of Cancer in the crab, and it's very like defensive in that sense. Um,
Hard
and
shell on the outside, squishy inside.
yeah, and I think at its worst, like that's where you get a lot of like xenophobia, and you get this like intense emotional patriotism, right? Where it's this sort of like kitschy emotional thing versus like deeply thought out or like intellectually rigorous.
Like the whole putting up defenses first before like addressing your like inner issue type thing.
Right. And
Almost
also,
your inner squishy meat.
like, I think interesting when the sun is in Cancer, it, like the sun is intellectual, it's leadership, and it's like it has to be emotionally true rather than factually true, right? Um, and that's where we get this idea also of like, I feel like Cancer and Capricorn are two signs where nostalgia is incredibly important and sort of the emotional imagination, the emotional idea is more important than the facts on the ground.
Like the mist from the water kind of obscures the true vision of the past, almost like that.
Yeah, it's like the everyone's obsessed with like especially I think with conservatives, right? It's the idea of the 50s versus what the 50s actually were, having any real knowledge of that time or how people really were then. It's the idea of traditional values, even though what you're saying is traditional wasn't actually true in that time frame that you are mythologizing, right? That's something that Cancer, generally speaking, and this isn't a right or a left issue. It's like a general issue. It's easy to mythologize. It's easy to idealize the past, even if that past, and to miss the important like other pieces of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a Cancer moon. I do that shit all the time. You know
Yeah,
what I'm saying?
yeah.
Like it's a whole thing.
And it's like the difference between doing it right and knowing your strengths and weaknesses, right? Like you can be incredibly protective, you can be incredibly caring, and it's like you can be incredibly generous, particularly with Jupiter in Cancer, right? It's like how expansive and hopeful and nurturing will you be, right?
Look, me and the United States have those things in common, to be honest. So like
Yeah.
it's a whole work in progress. I know it's not a person, but we can do it, fam. If I can get therapy, so can the rest of
We
us.
can do this.
We
We can
can
do
do it.
this. Yeah.
We'll make it affordable. We'll figure it out.
Yeah.
We
I
can
mean,
change the world, damn it.
well, I think it's funny that you bring up affordability too, because all this is in the eighth house, right? And the whole sign house schema. And the eighth house is like taxes, debt, and it's like wrapped up in other people's finances. And a huge piece of American power has been that, the sort of way that our debt has been has been sort of an institutional grounding thing within the financial markets, right? It is tying our money in with everybody else, right? It's China holding debt. It's all these places holding debt, or at least having used to be holding debt until recently, which is a little bit scary to watch. Um, and does make me concerned for when Jupiter enters Leo this summer, when when transit Jupiter is no longer continuing to stabilize this area. But that's future part of the episode. But right, a lot of our nation and its success has been through debt, has been as like the petrodollar, and also right as the protector, the benefactor of other people's resources, right? The world police, Whether or not we should be, I don't I don't think that we need to be doing that. But right, that's a lot of what we have been doing, right, for the last God, 70 years. Um, so yeah, that's the kind of Cancer stellium. We can maybe go into depth into each one of these planets, but like that would be a lot. And I want to kind of get to the moon because I think the moon is really interesting for the United States, particularly because the moon represents the people. It's very much like the everyday person. It's not so much like the leaders. And I just feel like when I talk about this moon, it's going to be like, oh, this completely makes sense. It did for me. So let us look at the chart again with a funny voice from me.
I mean, to be fair, it's made a lot of sense so far.
Oh my God. So all of that stuff in Cancer, right? All of the sun, the Jupiter, the Venus, the Mercury, all of that, anything that is in the sign of Cancer, and this is regardless for any chart. Um, Cancer is under the domain, it is the house or the home of the moon. And so wherever the moon is matters a lot. Now, the moon in the Sibley chart is at 27 degrees of Aquarius, right? So if this declaration, right, was signed, I don't know, 6 hours later, the moon would have been in Pisces. It seems highly unlikely that this declaration was signed at 11 o'clock at night. Um, Anytime during July 4th, it would have, other than that, it would have been solidly within Aquarius. So let's just talk about what Aquarius is, right? Aquarius is like a fixed air sign. It's considered masculine or AK proactive, is the way I like to often talk about it. So it's going to be very intellectual. It's going to be very idea focused. It's also going to be very difficult for it to kind of pivot and change. The moon doesn't love that, right? The moon's very changeable. It moves very quickly. Um, and the moon represents the people. It's very like the populace, right? I think it's very interesting that so much of this chart is dependent on the people, which might feel like is not true right now, but is like astrologically baked into the nature of this, that like the moon rules Cancer. And so the moon is incredibly important in this chart because of how many planets are relying on it for support, right? Aquarius is always an outsider, in my opinion. It's like who has the best view, who has the best vista, and it can feel like a nation of outsiders, of people that feel like they, come from a traditional places or the story of being the outsider. That feels very emotionally true. Whether or not it's literally true is going to be different, right? This is feels and the subjective reality. It's also just like, particularly in this last area of the zodiac, this is like the most Saturn part of the zodiac. It's in Saturn's sign, Aquarius. Saturn has triplicity or sort of elemental dignity in the air signs, which is what Aquarius is. And the moon is in Saturn's bound, right? You can't really get more Saturn than that. Even if you were in the Saturn bound of Capricorn, Saturn, like, there's no triplicity for Saturn, no elemental alignment in Capricorn. So, pretty heavy as far as that goes. There's a lot of weight and responsibility. We get that very like heaviness of Saturn around like, but is it going to last? What is the endurance? And so, legacy and like long-term thinking and like that sort of bigness is also baked in, which is interesting for like the optimistic, the fast, the impulsive. There's that sort of dichotomy that we're already sort of feeling, right?
So what you're telling me is we actually have daddy issues.
Probably a bit of it's all the issues, right?
I'm
There's
just,
no perfect chart, but yeah, there's
yeah.
issues. And particularly this decan that is the moon or Venus, depending on the decanic system that you use, is called the knot, right? It's a space. Kira Ryberg describes it as it's a space where we're asked, right, just how tightly our knots are wound up in another, which I think is very interesting. And I also think it's like a lot about the emotional myths or sort of the myths that the people as a whole feel are emotionally true, right? The things that we hold on to from sort of an emotional safety and emotional psychological perspective. And that we won't, how hard we hold on to them, even if the facts on the ground aren't real. Like this idea of the American meritocracy, this idea that anyone can change their fortune in here, which honestly, class ability to change that has been really, hasn't really been like that way for a while. Like that's not what the studies really show us, is that in some ways that was a lot more true in the 19th century when, spoiler alert, we were stealing land from indigenous people, right? It was on somebody else's backs, but there was a lot more ability at that time frame to change your class status than there is actually today. But there are some people when you say that to them, like you've shot a puppy, right? This idea of the meritocracy, these things that are really emotionally important and I think are actually beautiful ideas, but we refuse to work to make them better because we think that there's just emotionally true and valid because we're American, you know? Um,
They say that like it's hard to kill an idea.
yeah, and I think if there's anything that Aquarius placements will tell you is like, I have a, I was actually, I joke about this. I have a good friend who's an Aquarius rising, and I remember talking to her at some point, and like, she had a bad breakup. It was rough. She had every right to be really raw about it, and at one point, she was like convinced that she was never going to date again. As her friend and somebody I love dearly, I was not going to be like, that seems unrealistic. But I was going to acknowledge that, like, the pain that she was in. But, like, if you had tried at that time to, like, have a discussion about that, you're dealing with an immovable force. And you have to really want to fight that. She's really happy now and in a relationship with somebody that seems great and like things have changed. But like the mental stubbornness of Aquarius is second to none, particularly in this part of Aquarius that is so Saturn, that is so heavy, that is so rigid. Just something to keep in mind. I also want to talk about this decan is really, really fascinating to me, right? We've talked about it as the knot. Uh, but it's also, I think, really kind of funny because this decan is known to be kind of like coarse and insulting. And it makes me think a lot about like the American tourist and how much shit American tourists get. Once again, we're picking up the Picatrix for a minute. I'm just going to read this, which is a man. The image that Picatrix has is, quote, a man with his head shortened and who has an old woman with him. And this is a face of abundance, of the perfection of the will, and of insulting behaviors, right? So you get this combo of somebody who's willing to get what they want and can get it. And there is this abundance, right? There is this wealth, but he's real rough around the edges, right? And I think Americans we have kind of almost a pride in sort of the lack of etiquette. And I think that really sort of is summed up in some ways here, which I think is very interesting. Um, Another piece that I think is fascinating that Kira Ryberg also has brought up, which is just like, you know, people willing to make uncomfortable choices in order to pursue their dreams, including leaving behind what and who is known to them. Which, like, how there's so many, like, so much of the American story for people is migration and being an immigrant, whether it's an immigrant to the United States or immigration within the United States, right? We think about the Great Migration of the 20th century, which is probably one of the biggest internal migrations in US history as African Americans, Black people were moving from the South to other parts of the United States. And it was millions of folks, right? And then there's also just the story of like people moving west, picking up their whole lives to try and make it in Hollywood is like such an American story that is very interesting to sort of see baked into the moon, the one about the people. Um,
And for some reason too, my brain was thinking about the like new money that would marry into old money for titles and
mm,
yeah, integrate that kind of I don't know, the like it came to mind and I was like, ooh, like all that train money.
yeah, yeah, you get a lot of that, and it's funny too because yeah, you have a lot of women that Like Churchill's mother is a great example of this in the 19th century, where you get a lot of American Gilded Age money propping up British aristocracy that needed the cash. And then the women get titles. Huge, huge amounts of that was happening towards the end of the 19th century, um,
And
which
I
is,
was thinking of that rough around the edges, right? Going into kind of like trying to fit into these places. Well, they don't necessarily fit in, too, right? But,
exactly.
they have the cash flow.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think like that's part of it is there's this sort of, at its best, it's an outsider, it's willing to work hard. And at its worst, I think it does give a little bit of that victim complex, right? It gives that little bit of like, I'm always an outsider. I'm always the like, there's a lot of, I think, particularly with white fragility in the United States. I'm like, you can both be a victim of a system and also an oppressor within those systems. It's not one or the other, right? You can be both. And I think that's just something important for us to kind of hold some space for, which is like,
Life is incredibly nuanced.
yeah. And I think, it's very easy, I think, in this decan and in this bound to be very rigid, right? And this is Saturn's bound. And it gives it that sort of harshness, right? It also means that the people, right? Another thing to consider as we talk about transits later, the people are particularly sensitive, right? The people in the moon are particularly sensitive to Saturn transits. And we've just had a very important Saturn transit, which I talk about way too much, I think, which is the Saturn Neptune conjunction at 0 degrees Aquarius. We're also about to have a Saturn opposition with the natal Saturn, right? That 14 degrees of Libra, Saturn is stationing retrograde there around July 4th. This is why everyone's freaking out about July 4th. Saturn is stationing opposing the natal Saturn. This is a big deal for the moon. This is a big deal for the people rather than leadership, rather than like other things. Just saying. Um, and overall, this sort of Saturnian vibe gives us a real question around time, legacy, and endurance, right? What are we building, right? People want to get big because they want their name in lights and they want to be remembered, right? It's like, what is our legacy? What are we building that will withstand time? That sort of what is able to be sort of Saturnian, not just like a flash in the pan, I think is a thing that people think about more. Um, like I think about the song Fame. I'm gonna live forever. I'm gonna live like a star. I'm gonna live forever. Baby, remember my name. Right? Like that's like part of it is that like idea of being memorialized or immortal in that sense, which I think is, yeah, really fascinating. I mean, even despite all of this Saturn, I do think it's interesting that the final piece around this moon that I really think is fascinating is it's in the 12th part of Sagittarius. So once again, there's this sort of Jupiter optimism, hopefulness. What's interesting generally, right, is the ascendant is in Sagittarius. The 12th part of the moon is Sagittarius. The 12th part of the sun is Sagittarius. There's a lot of this underlying optimism, confidence, hopefulness just baked into this chart. Whether or not there should be is different. And right, it brings in that sort of why are we doing all of this work? Why are we doing all the grit and the work and the hustle? It's for something bigger. And we also idealize it, right? Like America loves hearing about somebody that is like pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, working 20 hours a day, like doing all of this stuff. Whether like some of that's really gross and I think gets into sort of Pluto and Capricorn and like the grossness of capitalism. But it's like there is a love of the Saturn harshness for something bigger and optimistic. And that vice versa is very interesting to see. I mean, I think you see both like the positives and the negatives in this chart, right? Like I don't think it's there is no, I mean, I'm never the person that's like, oh, this, I mean, there are some charts where I'm like, yikes, I would not want that for something specific, like elections or like releasing a thing or a project. Like that's a little different. Like it's hard with like a nation, unless you had an astrologer there, like working to elect the right time or the thing that you want, because this thing's going to live for hundreds of years. Um, even, I mean, what's so fascinating to me is Baghdad, the city, has an elected chart. Like Baghdad was intentionally started, the caliphate was very closely tied with astrologers. They had, and when before they built Baghdad, Baghdad was like an intentional city. They had astrologers elect a specific chart for that city. Even the strongest chart you're going to find is still going to have moments of weakness and difficulty because it's lived for hundreds of years, right? Um, and so I don't think like no astrologer in the year 1200 could have foreseen, you know, American imperialism in the beginning of the 21st century, right? And so I think what you see in this chart is both the optimism and the hope, but also the greed, the like idea that more is always better, which can be very Venus Jupiter together. Um, right? This idea of like the militant underpinnings of it all is very much there as a sort of idealization of ideas and holding on to them so tightly that you can't see when facts on the ground change, right? There's both that resilience, but there's also that stubbornness. And we are also just in a time frame where this particular chart is dealing with challenge, right? We talk about sort of at a high level a little bit, but like we're dealing with one of the most important, like we're lucky right now that we're in a Jupiter return. Jupiter is in Cancer, so there is some support and buoyancy there. That is ending early summer. We're starting a Saturn opposition. So Saturn is down here in Aries right now. It's going to oppose the natal Saturn. So this idea of structures, contracts, right? The legal system in some ways is tied up in this. Like there is a lot around questioning of stability and infrastructure, particularly the things that were built at other Saturn Neptune conjunctions. So I think a lot of the stuff that we're seeing being destabilized comes from the 1953, 1954 Saturn Neptune conjunction in Libra. The Department of Education and Health were started as one department right after the Saturn Neptune conjunction in Libra. That opposition happens, they're being gutted, right? They're being dismantled. I'm not saying that means that it's going to be that way forever, but like we're dealing with sort of the things that were probably especially built and fought for in the 50s being attempting to dismantle and undermine them. We're seeing that with the Voting Rights Act, right? We're seeing all of this really shitty stuff. And I think some of that is like the corruption of the legal system is a huge piece of that with Saturn and Aries, right? So we're dealing with that. We've just had our Pluto return. So we got Pluto and Capricorn. And a lot of this is about like how the United States makes money, right? The second house is like how we make money. That's our own finances. And we've done it on the backs of enslaved people, of stealing people's land, the like the scars and the shadows of ourselves. It's deeply tied into who we are. And so many people not willing to face that and so many people willing to kind of continue to perpetuate that.
I wonder where the moon was when the government asked us to Venmo them.
Wait, when did they do that?
That was, oh gosh, that I can't even remember how long he's been in office now. It feels like forever. It must have been last year.
So we just finished that Pluto return. And a lot of like Pluto and Aquarius, right? The first time frame was when we were building the Constitution and forming the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And so there is, I think, foundational questions around the Constitution that are probably going to come up. Like, who are we? What are we? What are we building? What are the ideas of the nation? Um, we just finished a Neptune opposition. So our natal Neptune's at 22 Virgo, right? Neptune is now in Aries. Neptune's hanging out on the IC of this chart. And so there's sort of the illusions and fantasies around our foundation and who we are as a nation is coming up, right? And there's disillusionment with the foundation in different ways, depending on who you talk to. I think there is sort of Christian, nationalism that would say, no, 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 we've misunderstood it. This is a free nation for Christians, right? And there's
Free
also,
nation for Christians to elect a golden statue and
right,
host it.
right. Or there's like the
Very Jesus.
disillusionment of like, I think a lot of people more on the left that are like, hey, like the system is broken. This isn't serving the people. Like, what are we doing? Right? The bread and circus is not enough anymore. So that's like, I'm not saying this to scare people, but I'm saying to say this like you feel like you're living in interesting times because you are. And I hate to be the person that says that to you. But that is, I think, part of what we have to acknowledge. The final piece is Uranus is also returning to Gemini, which I've talked about, right? Uranus has just returned to Gemini. It's going to be here for about another 7 to 8 years. This happens about once every 80 years. And every time, and I say this seriously, every time Uranus has been in Gemini, the United States has been in a significant conflict. Revolutionary War, World War II, or not World War, Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II. The likelihood that we will be in a significant conflict within the next couple of years to me is high.
I mean, take your pick. There's so many that could go off, really, honestly. Like, yeah, it's it's easy enough to kind of see where where it's all.
Yeah. I think we're in a real period of great upheaval and great change, and also a really decision of what direction do we want to go in as a nation. Because I think if there's one thing you can take away from looking at this chart is that the people do foundationally matter. The people have way more power and potency than we'd like to admit because the moon in this chart is doing so much work. And that the United States is actually, and how I would describe this to an individual, like, hey, the more you support the moon, the more resources and support and abundance you're going to have, just based on how this chart is set up. And the more you actually deprive the people and undermine the people and keep their wages down and make sure that they don't have enough to eat or to live, the more the United States actually gets weaker based on how this chart is set up. And so, if there's anything, it's like, what are we willing to do to make sure our ideals aren't just real emotionally, but real tangibly, right? What are we willing to do to show up for each other? What are we willing to do to build the legacy we want, not just for me, myself, and I, but for each other, right? I very much am of the opinion that there is no one coming to save us. There is no superhero that's going to come. We save ourselves. And there's a real potency as challenging as this like very Saturnian moon is, to get some to work together to make something better.
And I think, you know, we were talking about the, pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. It's almost that kind of thing, like we have to save ourselves. We have to pull ourselves up by bootstraps, but not really, because at the same time, while it is really kind of that concept of like, okay, we have to get out of bed. We just have to get out of bed, right? That, like, I feel like that moon is like, don't forget your community vibes
Yeah.
almost. Like, we as a nation became a nation, right? Because people were like, no. right? So we as people can also collectively be like, absolutely the fuck not. Like,
Yeah. I mean, one thing
and
we didn't talk about is that this is the third house. There is something I think hyper local in sort of the consciousness even as widely geographic and as big as some of the chart is. The third house is very local. It's the place of siblings. It's like your next door neighbors. It's your short distance travel, that kind of commute. It's, the local spots. And so I think there's a real potency of thinking on the local level, I think, with our moon. And I'm incredibly inspired by Minneapolis. And just like that feels very much like what is possible when you connect locally, when you build local power. Um, because part of the trickiness of the United States is we're fucking huge. You cannot be everywhere at once in this nation.
we're huge and we've been kind of like, especially, outside of certain cultures, but even within my own, because as someone who grew up within the like Italian American community, like as my grandparents aged, like I lost that. We kind of were assimilated. Like my Gen X, boomer X parents were, you know, in that gap where like Italian was like white, but not really white. Like, oh, you're hanging meat to cure in your shed. You're fucking weird, kind of, type that era. Right. And so they really wanted to step away from it. And so in that, I lost that community. Right. And that the way that my grandparents built that community to stay, protected. Right. So I know that when I think of things in like a bigger, like in the big, and like that, like, oh my God, the government, like, oh my God, this, like, I get so overwhelmed and I freeze. But the smaller I bring it in, the like easier it is to feel like I can actually like do something. So, like, I think that's just something
Yeah.
really important to focus on, especially like just with you bringing up like the third house, right? Like, the way that they learn to care for like their small community who learn to like do things to defend themselves, when there was a real issue, right?
Yeah.
Because, there's always been anti-immigration sentiment in this country. I mean, this whole book I read that I'm always talking about, it's Migra, by Kelly Lytle Hernandez. Um, my chronic shit's acting up. I'm having a little trouble talking
Oh,
today. But it talks about like the foundation of the United States Border Patrol. It goes into like some of that, and she kind of did some history and research on like both sides of the border on that foundation and the way it changed after World War II. And it kind of goes up to like just after 9/11 during the Bush era. And so it's just,
yeah.
yeah, it just is an interesting look at that and like proximity to whiteness and like the other and that. But anyway, keeping those communities, learning to bring those in a little smaller, like, you know, if you go to a regular coffee place, like talking with those people, bring your pamphlets, bring your whistles, make your signal
Yeah.
groups.
Yeah. And I think how you can be consistent, right? Because this is a fixed sign, is something that's important. Um, Completely. And yeah, there's lots of, I think, great groups doing things that are more like investing in local leaders. Run for Something, I think, is a fantastic organization to take a look at, even if all you want to know is like who might be running for local office in my area that might be I could support or, help. There's lots of things like that. So I wouldn't say that I am optimistic or pessimistic. I want people to know that like I think we're gonna do some more episodes kind of digging into this chart, how we sort of see different like types of history kind of show up and reflect in this, and also hopefully give some ideas as well, kind of digging into the future and like what we see coming forward. But I just want you to know that like if you feel like you're living in momentous times, like you're not crazy. The astrology sees you, and we're going to take it one day at a time because that's all you have to do right now.
Yeah. And just remember, we're here because people before us lived through momentous times. So,
That's
yeah.
that's real.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. 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 Also, also, our fabulous Katie does too. Charts.
I
Birth
do
chart, natal
readings.
chart readings. Do 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 do.
Yeah, so thank you for watching. If you would love a reading, check out my website, katieannastrology.com. Um, it's going to be going through a bit of a facelift as I start to offer remediation very soon. So keep an eye out for that. And we'll probably link as many of these resources as we can remember to in the caption below. But hope you enjoyed and subscribe to never miss another one of these videos.
Thank you. Bye.